Hello and welcome to this very special edition of the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum. Last month, this country came under attack. A terrorist attacked a soldier at Canada's National War Memorial and then stormed onto Parliament Hill. And 2 days earlier, another terrorist attack killed a soldier in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu in Quebec. And if you had any doubts that these were in fact terrorist attacks, about an hour ago I received a report from the Middle East saying that ISIS has now claimed responsibility for both those attacks. And in the meantime, of course, Canada's forces are fighting alongside its coalition partners in Iraq, trying to degrade and stop ISIS and stop the ISIS threat. So, what do we do about this in North America? Well, some would argue that the world is an inherently dangerous place, unreliable, unpredictable. So let's protect ourselves, let them fight it out over there. And they'd point out that in the past, when we've intervened, we haven't really helped ourselves that much anyway. The other argument is this, that and the attacks last month in Canada would serve as a reminder of this, that if we don't stop the threat over there, that threat is going to find us over here. So, Fortress North America, how glorious, how free, that is what we're discussing today. And let me introduce our panel, an extraordinary group of people here, starting with General Grass, the Director of the American National Guard, Tom Lawson, General Tom Lawson, the Canadian Chief of the Defence Staff, Rob Nicholson, Canada's Minister of National Defence, and General Charles Jacoby, who is the commander of both NORAD and NORTHCOM. And let me tell you a little bit about the audience we've got here as well, because there's some extraordinary people in here. I see Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel, is joining us. I see Peter MacKay, of course, Canada's Justice Minister. Bob Paulson is here, the Commissioner of the RCMP. And also Admiral Mike Rogers, who's the General in charge of the National Security Agency in the United States. Let me start with the panel. You gentlemen know as well, probably if not better than anybody else in this room, about the threats that we face in North America. And if I could just ask you quickly, what is the one thing that keeps you awake at night? General, do you want to start?
Thanks, Tom. Probably the one thing that keeps me awake at night more than anything else is a no-notice attack or a no-notice disaster. Being the head of the National Guard, and I work very closely with Chuck Jacoby on that, and we've gotten very good at responding to regional type events, but I think the no-notice, large scale, and especially as the nation looking out 10, 20 years where we have more larger mega cities, how are we going to take care of those people?
And just before I move on, when you say a no-notice attack, that's one that we weren't expecting, that we didn't know about before it happened?
Yes.
Okay. General Lawson.
I'll kind of build on Frank's point, Tom. I would say that what would keep me awake at night is the sense that Canada might develop some sort of complacency that would come along with a notion of Canada being part of a fortress North America. A fortress gives a sense of walls, keeping away all threats, when in fact we're anything but. That would develop a sense of complacency that may in the future might have Canadian public, the government, the military all ease their posture in face of what Frank's talking about.
Minister?
Well, it's the type of thing that we saw just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, we know that the world changed after 9/11. I worry about the changes that we might see as a result of the attacks in Canada. And I worry that these things, we don't want them to change the way we live our lives. We don't want them to change the kind of society that we grow up in. And so I worry about that, but this is the challenge that we have to meet.
General Jacoby.
I'm going to follow something the minister just said, and that's the military in both our countries, because of law, custom, policy, and tradition, we don't necessarily lead in all of the security dimensions that our people require. And so one of the things I worry about, and I guess I just summarize after 3.5 years of being the NORAD and NORTHCOM commander, it's not one thing, it's being late to need. Being late to need because we didn't have the capability, we weren't in position, we might not have had the relationship that was required, and didn't meet the needs of our people at a time of their greatest challenge.
So we briefly touched on what the problem is. So let me ask you then, is the solution to this, to all of the fears and the existential threats that exist for North America, can we build, you mentioned it, General, Fortress North America? Do we want to build it? And specifically, how would we go about doing that? Would it be a common security border, perimeter defense, perimeter security, as has been talked about in the past? General Lawson, do you want to start with that?
Well, to a certain extent, I think, Tom, we built it with whoever put in place the oceans, the big anti-tank ditches between us and many of the portions of the world where threats might be developed, and that provides a certain amount of safety to the three nations of North America. But I think that we may, if we take too much comfort from that, miss the fact that many threats, probably less the existential ones and more the ones that hit more regularly, are already well within the fortress. We've already spoken here about a couple that happened in Ottawa and Saint John recently. Those were radicalized Canadians. They did not come from the outside. They were not going to be stopped by any fortress walls, using any analogy. Diseases, fires, floods, hurricanes, which so often take up all of Frank's National Guard members and so many of our divisions of soldiers for sandbagging. Cyber attacks that are really already well within, and it's tough to put up any fortress walls. I think we have to recognize that any sense of fortress really is broken down when we understand that many of the threats are already well within.
But in many ways, General Jacoby, we do, even though there are the new threats, the old threats are there, coming by land, by sea, by air. You're involved, of course, as the commander of NORAD, know that as well as anybody. Do we have to increase the defensive position of North America from where we are right now?
Well, I think that following up again on what the chief mentioned, really the distinction between what we used to conceive of as an away game and a home game is becoming less assured. And so we see the events overseas easily reflected back into the homeland. And so I think that an informal grand strategy that seems to have been in place since 1917 of engaging the world in order to better defend the continent. I think now there are threats and vulnerabilities that require us to do both, to both stay engaged and both concern ourselves with true defense and true security requirements within our country and at the perimeter of our continent.
You've seen this for quite some time. I mean, the Joint Defense Board that's been in place since 1940, NORAD that was put together. Again, these are examples of Canada and the United States working together because there's been long time recognition that there's no threat to the United States that's not a threat to Canada or vice versa. We understand that. And I think that this has been in place. And when you see attacks like we have seen, this reinforces and makes the case for the importance of that relationship between the two countries. But quite apart from that, we have to remember that we have to sometimes deal with these things outside of the borders of the continent. And one of the things that we have made very clear with the airstrikes in Iraq is that a threat, the ISIL threat, is not just a threat in that part of the world, it's a threat right here. It's a threat right here in Canada. And so when we deal with it there, in a sense, we are dealing with it in a very real way here in Canada and the United States.
General Grass, your whole command is about the homeland as head of the National Guard. What do you need that you don't have now to better protect the homeland?
Well, if anything, and something that Chuck and I have spent a lot of time working on is figuring out how do we organize for that worst night in America, and how do we make sure when a state responds to the needs of its citizens or a territory or the District of Columbia, and they don't have a capability, just like Chuck said, we've got to make sure it's there, but we've got to rehearse it ahead of time. And on the large-scale disasters or a large-scale attack, that's the area we're spending a lot of time on right now and developing playbooks. We call them playbooks that Chuck's done some great work on. Because again, the American people have a higher expectation today, I think, than we did 80, 100 years ago, definitely. They were much more resilient because they had to be. They were more rural. And as we move more people into the cities, I think definitely the expectation, we've got to meet that.
What I'm hearing is that this is not a simple matter. It's a complicated issue because defense is both home and abroad, as you say, the away game, General. But if you could sketch out for me, anybody on the panel here, sketch out for me what would be, if there was such a thing as a common North American defense strategy, what would that look like? What would it be? General, do you want to start?
Well, I'll just build on something the minister just said. If there was a common defense strategy, and in fact there is. Chuck has talked about playbooks. The commander of Joint Operations Command here with us today is well involved in that from the Canadian side as well, working on a defense plan. Our Mexican partners are frequently in trilateral meetings with us. But something that the minister just said was that no matter what we develop for the defense against any threats that make themselves apparent here on the continent, I think it's also key that we recognize that we've got to take steps externally, aggressive steps, as the minister was just saying, and here are two coalition partners that are part of doing the right thing against ISIL, but also with a view to ISIL, as you just made clear, Tom, bringing them down before they can become threats to home territory. But even in a less aggressive sense, the three-letter agencies in the United States and the four-letter agencies here in Canada, the many-letter agencies of Mexico work together to be more aware of threats as they're arising and before they come to arise, and we've met with great success as groups. So I think whatever future, as we get better at providing defense to our nation, it will be more and more leveraging the relationships that we have internationally and in a forward defense sense.
Minister, let me veer off into politics with you a little bit, because some people might feel that when you talk about a more integrated common defense strategy for North America, and whatever that may entail, that there's an element of that also suggests that countries like ours, the smaller partner in the relationship, inevitably has to give up a certain amount of sovereignty and control. From a political point of view, because all this stuff has to be sold politically as well, how tough a sell is that?
I think, first of all, I don't believe there is any giving up of sovereignty. I mean, we enter into NORAD, other arrangements with the United States or indeed other countries, and we do that on our own. We make the decision. It makes sense for us. And so this is a relationship that has worked very, very closely, again, since 1940 and since the late 50s when they put together NORAD. Again, the case has already been made and it's in place. And so this cooperation between the two is very important. It works well, and I think Canadians accept that. They understand the security threats to North America and indeed to the world, and so it's a relationship that works. So I don't buy into the idea that somehow anybody's giving up anything. I mean, we're part of NATO. We're not giving up anything for this country because, again, it works for us. We want it to work.
I feel like, as the NORAD commander, that it's two countries with such confidence and trust in each other and confidence in their own sovereignty that we can share these sovereign interests together in the defense of North America. So I don't see it as a giving up or a gaining equation.
I guess where I'm trying to push a little bit just to get a conversation is we live in Northcom, the military district that covers Canada. This is a U.S. command. In a newly integrated North America, would you ever share command of Northcom with us or the Mexicans?
Well, Northcom is a little bit different than NORAD, but yeah. I think we have mechanisms in place that allow plenty of decision-making space for our political leadership. And our challenge is to make sure those mechanisms can react in a fast-twitch way, from the speed of the network operations to the speed of aerospace weapons. So I think that's a choice that has to be made by political leadership, but we've got unique relationships both as NORAD and NORTHCOM and the Canadian Joint Operations Command that I think put in place a way to handle the threats that are extant today.
I want to go to the audience as soon as I can, so if anybody would like to join this conversation, catch my eye, I'll come up and talk with you. And as I'm waiting for people to do that, the other day I spent some time with former General David Petraeus and Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank. They produced a report about reimagining North America and what that would look like. So much, of course, of what they're talking about is the economy and energy, because both are security issues. If you want, I'm wondering though, and Minister Nicholson, I might throw this to you. When we're talking about integration and now going on to include these other elements, how far can you see it going from where it is now?
I think we've made great progress over the years. I mean, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the agreement that was originally put together by Canada and the United States, it was removing tariff and other barriers between trade because ultimately it made sense. It makes sense to break down the barriers for trade. Nobody is giving up anything. Nobody's compromising themselves by improving the ability to trade amongst each other. And so the things that we have worked with the United States, they all make sense on any level. You know, working with them on North American defense. It's nobody's compromising themselves. It makes sense for both of us. We both benefit from these, whether it's NORAD or North American Free Trade. I mean, these things are important. And in the end, just as other countries who enter into relationships, we continue to have the ability to always say no or to withdraw. But again, when you talk about these things, yes, they work, they make sense, let's do it. That's what we have to do.
Okay, I'm going to go up into the audience. I'm going to walk over here. And if I could ask you to stand up and just identify yourself.
Yes, sir. Christian Whiten from the Hamilton Foundation. A question for the two distinguished Canadian panelists. We've seen in the United States a tremendous spike in illegal immigrants crossing the southern U.S. border this year. So, within the context of North American security, are you concerned about the unsecured U.S. border?
I think you directed it to the Canadians. It might be the Americans who want to answer that, but certainly, you know, we have confidence in our American neighbors that they share many of the same concerns, the issues that we all do in North America. So yes, I do have confidence.
Could I just add to that, and it's not exactly where you wanted to go, but I'm going to build on that thought. You're looking at someone who's absolutely unconcerned with the American border, but very concerned with many other borders in parts of the world where large numbers of refugees who very much would like to live within Fortress North America would arise from. And I think we've proven that one way to deal with that is once a refugee ship is within Canadian waters, to bring them in under controlled circumstances into our port and then bring them into our society. That's actually jumping a lot of official lines that are held by other agencies within our nation. The far better way to do it is to leverage intel overseas, and that has been very effective in recent years in various continents of highlighting to Americans, Canadians, where these ships could arise from and interceding in that.
Tom, I don't want to leave my Canadian colleagues alone in the question on our border. I would propose to you, though, that maybe a concern for others in Canada in particular would be one of the imperatives or one of the problems along our border we share, and that's the power, the violence of transnational criminal organizations that exploit everyone's borders. And so there's no one illicit activity, there's many illicit activities, and I think they are a threat to all of our societies. They are global in nature now. They're becoming powerful networks that along their distribution routes ride many evil things. And so I think that's something that all of us as a community of nations in North America, need to address.
I'll point out, I was talking about David Petraeus' report. One of the things he says in there is that a more integrated North America would mean that the problem of transnational organized crime in Mexico becomes our problem, not just Mexico's problem, and that's the only way you're going to solve it. As I move to the next question, though, I do want to throw one thing out that came up from that last question. One of the other things in the Petraeus report was the concept of once admitted, thrice admitted. In other words, if you come in through the Canadian border, General Lawson, you were talking about that refugee ship, if we accept those refugees into Canada, and if there is going to be a common North American approach to this, what about that proposal of saying if we accept refugees into Canada, that they should then be automatically accepted as refugees into Mexico and the United States? And Minister Nicholson, I see you laughing about that.
Again, I don't think that's going to work, quite frankly. I mean, we all have our own rules with respect to accepting individuals or encouraging immigration or accepting refugees. These are national decisions, and I don't think, quite frankly, it would work. A decision by one country would be binding on another. I just don't think that's in the mix.
Anybody else want to jump into that mess? No. Okay, we're going to go to this question here. Sir, if you could stand up, identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm John Glenn with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition in Washington. As the military, you bring unique capabilities, but as you've already suggested in your panel, many of the threats that we face here in North America aren't traditional military threats. And one aspect of those challenges is that the targets of a lot of these public threats are in private hands. Here I'm thinking about infrastructure, I'm thinking about a lot of issues, electric power grids, things that would completely disable us if they were targeted. What practices are you developing to working and dealing with issues about the resources and targets that are in private hands?
Great question.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest challenge is not so much technical capability as it is deciding methods and mechanisms for supporting. And so in the United States, I would have said 10 years ago, it wasn't a core task for the military to support civil authorities. I would say today it's an expectation that we'll be effective supporting civil authorities. And so you do see us responding in support of lead agencies in natural disasters. I think we're going to have to figure out the similar mechanisms to support commercial and private interests when they become threatened and they have national significance. Figuring out ways and authorities to support agencies that are going to need to help with things like energy grids, transportation grids that have national significance. So I think there's a lot of work to do on that, but there is precedence, and Frank and I have worked on quite a bit of that with not only within our department, but it's important for us to be working with Congress as well on that.
On that note, we have to take a short break. We're going to continue with more of this right after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum. I want to point out something here. We have the largest congressional delegation ever to come to Canada, led by Senator John McCain of Arizona and Tim Kaine from Virginia. Thanks very much. Senator McCain, you've been involved in this forum since the beginning. You're obviously seized with the issue of how we operate here in North America, especially cooperatively. What do you think about the idea of creating a greater Fortress North America? Does that make any sense to you?
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me because I think that there's very little doubt of what the intentions of ISIS is and other terrorist organizations, but particularly as we see them strengthening and enlarging their influence throughout the Middle East. Mr. Baghdadi, who is the leader, as we know, of ISIS, who spent 4 years in our Camp Bucca in Iraq, on his way out the door, said to his American captors, he said, "I'll see you in New York." And Mr. Baghdadi was not known for his sense of humor. And so I don't think there's any doubt that our Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA, and our Director of Homeland Security have all stated that ISIS, over time, pose a direct threat to the United States of America, and that, of course, means Canada as well.
Senator Kaine, any concerns on your part about greater integration? Are there downsides to this?
no downsides. There are going to be areas where the level of cooperation may not be complete integration, but I always found, even as a mayor, my police force got along better with the county police force than any other area of government. The security level of cooperation is strong. The only quibble I would raise, I want to find a better word than fortress, because fortress to me still kind of conveys a little bit of an inward looking. We put up the wall and then we try to avoid penetration from outside. We have so much to offer the world on the offense side in values and trade and culture, and whether it's journalists who can do what they do free from imprisonment, or advances for marriage equality. I mean, we got a lot to offer the world. So I want to find a better word than fortress, but the shared values have so much to offer, not only within these three countries but beyond.
Thanks very much. One of the things that I wanted to get back to, since we're talking about forming this greater cooperation in North America, the one question we haven't asked is, what is North America? And let me bring up the rather difficult topic that some have talked about, that if this was an alliance between Canada and the United States, two countries that are very much alike, share the same systems, in many ways the same culture, the same language, that makes sense. To include Mexico, and with a nod, of course, to the Mexican representatives who are here, what is the rationale for including Mexico in North America? General Jacoby, obviously in NORTHCOM, it is part of your command, but I'm wondering if you can give more of a rationale to it.
Right. Well, within my area of responsibility for military to military cooperation, Mexico is an important partner. And I would say over the last 3 years, we've had an extraordinary increase in our cooperation, and it's been based on understandings of shared threats, and that cooperating on those shared threats is of critical importance. So we've increased the venues of cooperation, not just with the United States, but trilateral venues with the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And as that trust and confidence grows, and then that understanding of a shared security concerns, I could see us increasing those mechanisms for cooperation. Just this year, their participation in RIMPAC and Bold Alligator, major military exercises, demonstrates their interest in continuing our partnership that's been growing.
Okay, there's a gentleman here, I think, who wanted to. Yes, sir, go ahead. Sorry, we'll wait until, here, let me come over there. I'll come over here. Thanks very much.
Sure. I'm Kevin Barron, Executive Editor from Defense One. Earlier we talked about ISIS. I wonder if you can give us a situation report, because before the Ottawa attacks back in the U.S., we heard a lot of concerns and worries about ISIS at the border, but it was in Mexico. That's what we were talking about. Now we know there is a threat up here. So where are we now? Is there any connection to any ISIS threat at the border in Mexico and up here in Canada? Explain it, to the public. What are we concerned of? Are these converts? Are these domestic converts to Islam? Are they 10 guys, 100 guys? How big is the threat, and how much of it is a concern for military, your military commands, NORAD, NORTHCOM, and in Canada, versus intelligence and other agencies?
Yeah, if I could just respond regarding the two attacks that happened in Canada. I'm not sure about the southern border, and I'll leave that to my two American colleagues. But I think we should be clear in recognizing that the self-radicalization of the two attackers here in Canada displayed little linkage except auto linkage to ISIS. So no matter who's taking credit for it, as we heard at the start of the program, indications were that these attacks were quite unsophisticated. Therefore, the second one, in its success, in its attack on Parliament, has really shaken up the entire security complex that looks after that. But I think that's an important point to make. I'm not sure what intel we've got on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that trying to define this as a border or a geographical place, I think it's more important to think about this as a movement, maybe, and to think about, what are the methods of radicalization? What's the appeal? How is that coming across? And then what's the sacrifice? What are the trade-offs in our security and liberties that are at stake in that? And so it could manifest itself at a border where someone's trying to move from one country to the next, but I think that's the wrong place to think about the problem, at the border. I think we need to think about it within the hearts and minds of our young men and women that our adversaries are trying to inspire and trying to pervert. And I think that's a more important way to think about the problem.
On that note, I'm going to interrupt for a second and say we've got to take another break, but we're going to be back right after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of the West Block from the Halifax International Security Forum. We're going to continue on with some questions. Sir, do you have a question? Come on over here.
Thank you, Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, and I have a question about ballistic missile defense, continental ballistic missile defense. As you know, in 2005, the government of Canada chose not to participate with the United States in the continental ballistic missile defense system. I'm wondering, I guess I have a question first for the minister, whether this is something the government of Canada is currently reconsidering, and perhaps also a question for General Jacoby. What assets or capabilities could Canada add to the continental ballistic missile defense system that you don't already have?
Thanks.
Perhaps I could begin by saying that you're quite correct. In 2005, Canada said that it would not participate in ballistic missile defense. That being said, the issue has been raised again. We have a Senate report that has been tabled that was unanimous in requesting that Canada consider ballistic missile defense. And I know the House of Commons Committee on Defense is considering that as well. You may note in NATO that, or at NATO conference, that the wording within NATO is that the need for ballistic missile defense is not just a European concern, but it's a NATO concern. And so it includes Canada and the United States, but there's no decision or change of that decision that at the present time, of course, but again, we have to consider both the recommendations, certainly the recommendation of the Senate and then the views of the House of Commons on this.
Yeah, from my standpoint as NORAD commander, Canada has been part of the missile warning for North America since its inception. I can't afford to engage in the politics of, how far along is North Korea. In my view and the intelligence community's view, North Korea now must be considered a practical threat to North America for attack by ICBMs with weapons of mass destruction. I think there's the intent and the design of Iran to achieve the same capabilities, and I think the proliferation of missile technologies and weapons of mass destruction technologies keep that door open for other threats to emerge as well. So I believe that missile defense is important for the United States, it's important for the continent. This is clearly a Canadian decision on where we join missions together and integrate missions in NORAD, and I'm quite comfortable with where we are right now. But working together on security, as NORAD has demonstrated with Canada and the United States, is an enormous competitive advantage for us. And of course, any of the missions Canada joins with the United States, we gain from geography, we gain from technical capability, and we would gain from human capital that Canada brings to everything that we do together jointly.
Can I just ask one thing, because it was brought up by another questioner, and we were talking about threats to the grid system, the electrical grid in North America, and is Admiral Mike Rogers with us? Right over. I can either quote you, Admiral, or you can say it yourself. You've known about this for a long time, but now it's public. And can you give me 30 seconds on what that threat is that you see?
So I have stated that I'm concerned about the security of some of the basic infrastructure that North America, both Canada, the United States, I'm sure it's the same for my Mexican teammates, that the basic infrastructure has basic vulnerabilities in the computer arena, that it was not designed in many ways to reflect the realities of the world we're living in today. And I'm watching nation states pay attention to those vulnerabilities. And it's not just because they have idle curiosity, I don't believe.
We've heard from Admiral Rogers. If indeed our entire electrical grid is at risk, can you game this out for me? What on earth do we do if we're attacked in that way? National Guard be first up.
But one of the things that Admiral Rogers did when he first came into the job was come and visit me. I think we've been together, Mike, 6 or 7 times now. And the difficult part in the homeland, of course, the governors came to us and said, we want a capability in every state. Of course, we can't afford that. But at the same time, private-public partnerships own most of our infrastructure. So how do we work through the authorities? And we're spending a lot of time with the Department of Homeland Security, who has the consequence management role, as well as the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who has the responsibility for criminal action. And we're working through, we just did an excellent exercise in July with all these agencies and a lot of our military, both active guard and reserve, trying to get after the problem. But in the end, I think there's going to have to be some very serious debate on authorities of what's private, what's public, and when does the president step in? When can the president step in? And with all the proprietary information, it is, I know that Mike's spending a lot of time on that right now.
And because the grid is so interconnected between the two countries and eventually with Mexico as well, you're the next on the phone call, General.
Thanks, Tom. I generalize the question a little bit. The grid is one of the vulnerabilities out there, but they're too numerous to mention. And a point that Chuck made a little while ago is that many of these things don't fall under defense to start. Fall under police forces, security, the very first responses coming from power agencies. But very quickly, it could fall to defense and 3 of the individuals you see sitting here when asked to aid the civil power. That doesn't just happen. The call just happens, but a good response has to be based on a lot of exercise. Chuck just talked about a couple of exercises. The most expensive, the most elaborate exercise that we hold in Canada each year up north is a whole of government exercise with Department of National Defense, provincial representatives, local police forces, and then each time we go through it, we take away the lessons that we want to that are fed into the next exercise, and each of these adds to our readiness posture for when these actually do come to bear.
And you actually have responded. I mean, the case in Calgary that where the power outage. I mean, they turned to the military to assist to look after the people so they have a place of refuge. So it's working hand in hand with the civil authorities, I think, is the important component of this.
But essentially, though, we're starting with the requirement to collaborate, and then the next question is, will it be a calamity-based solution, or will the collaborative effort be sufficient to build resilience into critical infrastructure like the power grid or the transportation grid? And what would compel those communities to build resilience into their systems? And then I think a final question has to be, of course, each private entity would have bears responsibility to their customers or to their shareholders for protection, but do they bear the responsibility to protect themselves against the country of China or the country of Iran? And so there's some real basic questions out there that we'll need some help with answering.
I want to bring a new voice into here. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. First of all, welcome to Canada, Senator. You've been rather outspoken, especially about the situation your country faces on your southern border. When you think of an integrated North American defense, first of all, how does that strike you? What are the vulnerabilities? And can this happen before you've resolved the problem on your southern border?
Well, I think we certainly have common threats abroad, and our defense needs are closely integrated, and there's a reason that we are such close friends and allies. There is a serious problem on the southern border of the United States, and unfortunately, as the world gets more dangerous, as we see ISIS, as we see horrible diseases like Ebola, not having the southern border secured exposes our nation and also exposes Canada to significant perils, and it seems to me there's an imperative for us to step up and do something about that.
Are you concerned about the Canada-U.S. border?
We have seen far less of a problem on the northern border. There is not a population seeking in significant quantities to come illegally across that border the way there has been on the southern border, and that's where the security presence is manifesting. That's also where you see the heavy concentration of transnational drug cartels that are smuggling both drugs, and people, and right now smuggling children in vast quantities, and both physically and often tragically sexually assaulting those kids.
Thanks very much, Senator. I want to turn back to the panel for a second, and we're in conclusion mode here. But I'm wondering if I could ask each of you to map out for us, if you could look ahead 10 years with the initiatives that you are promoting or that you can imagine. How different is North America going to look in 10 years from now than it does today? And General Grass, let me start with you.
Okay. If I could look back 10 years for a second, and I think it boils down to our economic ties between Canada and us and Mexico. And if you look at how closely we're tied, after 9/11, the National Guard got called up. One of the first missions we got was Michigan, where the Adjutant General said he was putting 54 military policemen at the border crossing. And the reason why was because of the auto industry. Our just-in-time supply was going to lay off men and women in Canada as well as in the US in the auto industry within days. And so, in a huge backlog of parts and supplies moving back and forth across that border. And I think, you know, we have such great ties both with Mexico in our economy and Canada, and we have to somehow tackle this issue. And I think Chuck hit it right on the button as far as it's a transnational organized crime we're after. It's not drugs, it's not human trafficking. That's just a mechanism for those organizations to get cash, and it affects every city in our country, every major city in our country. So we have to go after that, and we have to have a strategy. I know that Chuck and you know, the Canadian forces have worked with us and really trying to get after a strategy, not just for me, you know, where it's state by state, but how do we bring all that together in a strategy to get after TCOs?
General Lawson.
I'll tie back to the opening point you were asking us, what would keep us awake at night, and what I painted was an idea of Canada becoming complacent in their defense addresses. And I would think if I look forward 10 years and draw a line from where we are today, where the nation, both nations have citizens that hold their men and women in uniform with such high esteem, and governments that recognize that and also recognize the importance of a military response in keeping North America safe. I think it's a very positive future. I think it's one that's going to be heavily leveraged using the asymmetries that are brought to us through the use of technology. And I think that will continue. I think that what we'll see is a continuation of a technological advancement that allows us to answer or address the greatest of these risks and vulnerabilities.
Rob Nicholson, I would guess that when you look ahead, what you don't see is a version of the European Union here in North America.
No, I don't see that, of course, but greater cooperation between Canada and the United States is certainly important. I mean, and I'll state my bias to begin with. I have 4 border crossings in my constituency, and I'm very interested and concerned for the border, but the main reason is this is the largest trading relationship in the world. That border has to work for the prosperity of both our countries. And so if you're asking me what I expect and hope for 10 years, I hope that border is even more fluid between both our countries. Yes, we have security concerns, but trade is absolutely vital to both of these countries. The border has to work. I want to see that.
General Jacoby.
I'll mention Robert Kaplan's book, Revenge of Geography. And I want to turn that on its head. And what I see is the blessing of geography here. And I see in North America 3 great countries who are economically, socially interconnected, and that we will define our security interests even more closely together as time goes by. And that with hard work and close collaboration, having our borders just define the best of us and not the challenges. And so I think a very positive future, and I think the mission of NORAD and the NORAD agreement challenges us to stay relevant and to stay collaborative and to take advantage of that enormous competitive advantage we have, and I think that that's something that we can achieve.
And I think probably having a national discussion as we're having right now about the future of North America with such a panel as this is a real step forward. General Jacoby, Rob Nicholson, Tom Lawson, General Tom Lawson, sorry about that, and General Grass, thanks very much. And to the congressional delegation from the United States, to all of you, thank you so much for joining us for this. It's been terrific. And I'll just say that the West Bloc wraps up its special edition from the Halifax International Security Forum. We'll be back in Ottawa next Sunday. Good night.